Well, hello, friends, and welcome to another Ask Zach. I hope you're doing well. Uh, you know, just having fun doing a little chicken picking on an old Jimmy Bryant tune. Jimmy Bryant wrote that called "Only Daddy That'll Walk the Line." Of course, it was a hit for Waylon Jennings, but other people recorded it, and Wayne Moss played the guitar solo on that on a Jazzmaster, and I think Marty Stewart owns that guitar now. But yeah, Wayne Moss, that's a guitar player you ought to look up. So played on some Dylan stuff, and was part of the Nashville Cats, and yeah. So today we're going to talk about the vintage mystique, or the antique mystique, and we're going to have fun. We're going to do a little, I hate to say myth busting, but this all comes from a phone call that a friend, made to me, and I just kind of want to address the whole vintage thing, vintage and boutique, vintage versus modern. I want to have my take on that. But first, while you're thinking about it, please go down in the corner and hit subscribe if you've been enjoying the show. And if you've subscribed already and you want to support the show, we'll go to askzach.com. You can go to the store and you can pick up one of these fun t-shirts or a mug or a hat. Or there's a tip jar information down there. So please do that, and that's what keeps the show going. So, the vintage mystique. About 2 weeks ago, a good friend of mine that works in the musical instrument, kind of industry, he called me up and he said, I think I'm going to sell one of my boutique amps and a boutique guitar, and I really I want something vintage. I want a vintage guitar. And part of me thought, oh, that's cool. But part of me thought kind of like, well, what's going on here? Why is it that he has these, great guitar and amplifier that he's just wanting something vintage? And so it made me really kind of analyze my thoughts on vintage. Obviously, I like vintage stuff and I like modern stuff. So, this is my 67 Telly that I've had for about a decade. And, of course, I have vintage amps, but I also have a lot of boutique stuff. I have Danocaster and Bill Crook, and, I've got new and old pedals and all sorts of stuff. I don't think of myself as a vintage snob, but maybe some of you do think of me that way. But I think if you've watched the show, you've seen that I use the boutique guitars as much or more than I use even my vintage one. So here are my thoughts on, the vintage mystique or the antique mystique. So first off, you have this sense of nostalgia and you have this sense of romanticism, and because you think of vintage guitars as being the guitars that your heroes played. And and they're old and they're expensive, and so automatically they're seen as being better, and part of this is propagated by the major collectors and the dealers of vintage guitars, because it's there to advantage for them to have more mystique attached to them, and also to continue to push up the value of them. One of the things I want you, the viewer, to understand is that when you're buying new guitars or boutique guitars, there's a certain amount of, with consumerism, there's not a lot of rationalism, but there's still a little bit more rationalism when it comes to buying new guitars and amps and such. But when you enter the vintage guitar world, you are entering the collectible marketplace. And in the collectible marketplace, it is very volatile, and it is driven by emotion and driven by fads. And in a sense, everything is. But, vintage guitar prices can go all over the place. And things can go up in value drastically. And if there's an economic downturn, probably one of the first things to get hurt in an economic downturn is collectibles. So that's why, the last big economic downturn, a lot of vintage guitars lost 40 to 50% of their value overnight. And it took a long time for them to recover. And part of that recovery was pushed by dealers and collectors that want their stock to be worth more money. And I have no problem with dealers and collectors, and that's their business. But if you're going to get into the vintage guitars, you need to understand that this is part of it. Just walk in with your eyes open. So this is, my 67 Telly. And frankly, the only reason I could afford this guitar was because of the last economic downturn. And so, I was able to get this guitar, and I don't really like to talk about what I paid for stuff, but, I got this guitar for $4,000. So, and this is, pretty much all original. The only thing that's not is like the output jack cup. So on it, it has if you look here, it's got a Rudders, jack on there because someone had actually put a big Gibson kind with 4 big screws on it. And so, but otherwise, it's an original guitar. So now, 10 years later, these guitars are selling for 8 to 10 grand, in this same condition. And it's like, and part of me is like, oh, that's kind of cool, but also it's kind of crazy too. And frankly, it makes me less comfortable playing this guitar and taking it out, because when this guitar was a $4,000 guitar, I would take it out on the road and I would play it. And even if I was in town, if I was doing a rehearsal or something like that, I could leave it in my trunk, and I'd probably still try to park someplace where I could see my car if I was stopping to eat someplace, but I wouldn't be freaked out about it. Well, the last time, this was 2-3 years ago, I did some road dates with a friend of mine, and I took this guitar, and I couldn't take my eyes off of it the whole time. So every time we would take a break, I had one eye on this guitar because it was sitting on the stage on a guitar stand up there that anyone could just hop up there and grab it. And frankly, it made me less comfortable, and it just made for the break that we had, I just wanted the break to be over. I wasn't even able to enjoy my break, and I'll just echo this. I recently interviewed Pete Anderson, and Pete Anderson was talking about taking his 59 Strat to a club, and he said, there's a $30,000 guitar that's sitting on a guitar stand. And he said, I didn't feel like I could, walk away from it hardly. And so he stopped playing it, and he started playing Music Craft, guitars that he put together, with parts, and had Mark Jenny, finish for him. So, yeah. So there's part of the vintage thing that also makes it to where, because of the value that's kind of been pushed up by the people in control of the market, it makes it to where these guitars are in some way less fun to play. The funny thing is that vintage amps have not gone up in value. So, a Blackface, deluxe reverb is still in the $2,000 to $3,000 range, and that's what it's been for like 20 years. Now, if you go back to the 90s, these were, probably $1,000 or less. But, for the last 20 years, since, around 2000, these amps have kind of been in the same, price range, and which is still in the same price range as a boutique. And so that's why it's like, well, I like vintage amps, and it's like, I don't sweat, a deluxe reverb. I've got 2 of them, and, I take them on gigs, and I don't think twice about it. It's like, I can find another one, they're under $3,000 in value, and it's like, I don't sweat it. So that's a big part of the vintage guitar thing. And so you need to know that there's this aspect of, it's not as much fun to go around and play because you have a guitar that's worth a lot of money, and you start sweating it, and you start thinking about the guitar and obsessing over it. And I've even had guys that had, really expensive vintage guitars like a Burst that, they took it with them, they took it with them into the restaurant that we ate at, because they couldn't let it leave their side at any point. Because again, then you're talking about a guitar that's worth $100,000. So let's talk about some of the positive things, about vintage guitars, and something that I will say that they do have. And there is something about old wood. I know I just did an episode on how wood affects tone, and I had some flat earthers respond that woods don't affect tone, and I'm sorry, I do not agree with that at all. And if you want to comment below, that's great. Wood does make a difference, and old wood makes a difference too. And so, and it's not just the old wood, it's the fact that the old wood has been a neck for a long time. So let's say you found some 100-year-old piece of pine and you made a guitar out of it. Well, that's good, but what's actually, what actually makes the most difference is when you have a piece of wood that has been a guitar neck and it's been under tension and it's been finished and it's been that way for 50 years, there's something about it. And there's something about it where the wood almost becomes like, for a lack of better terms, it almost starts to become like fossilized. And those old maple necks, like on 50s Telecasters and stuff, those necks, they seem super stiff, and they seem harder than a new guitar neck. And I think it's because it's old wood and it's been a neck for 50 years. So there are some things that are great, about old guitars. And yes, there is a nostalgia, and we love nostalgia. That's why, there have been these new Star Wars films made, and frankly, they're not very good. But we watch them because we hunger for nostalgia. And we keep having movies remade, and that's because we are just, we are nostalgia monsters, and we just consume it like crazy. So there is this aspect of vintage guitars, being nostalgia. It's being like what your hero played. It's old, it's cool. Also, vintage guitars have become kind of a rite of passage, or, it's like, I'm successful, I'm a cool guitar player, I have a vintage guitar. I can't tell you how many musical artists here in Nashville that as soon as they, had a hit, or they started doing well, the first thing they did was they went down to Gruen or Carter Vintage and they bought a vintage guitar and they had their picture taken and they posted it all over social media. It's a big deal because that's one of those rite of passages as a guitar player. When you have a hit and you're successful, you're supposed to buy a vintage guitar, and it's just become like this thing. And it's interesting, that again, these 50s and 60s Fenders and Gibsons have become like the gold standard. And if you're successful, you have to get one of these things. It's like having a gold ring on your finger or something like that. So it's very interesting. On the negative, another thing on the negative side is, frankly, old Fenders, they don't have very wide necks. They're 1 5/8. Some of them were a touch wider, especially like in the Blackguard era. They varied like crazy. But you tend to have, 1 5/8 or smaller. And, you have this 7 1/4 radius. And then you have little frets. And there's nothing wrong with that, but most people want a neck that's wider at the nut, more like 1 11/16. They want a flatter radius, and they want bigger frets. Why? Because it plays easier. And so, like with this guitar, I love this guitar, but it doesn't play. And I've had Joe Glazer refret it, and it's been plucked, and it has a great nut on it. It's set up fantastic. But it doesn't play as good, as my Danocaster or my Bill Crook. And that's it. And, and then whether it sounds better or not, that's subjective. I mean, that's up to you, the listener or the player. So, I mean, I've had friends of mine, tell me, man, that Danocaster is the best sounding guitar you have. And then I have another guy saying, that Bill Crook Paisley, that's the best sounding guitar, best looking guitar that you have. And then another friend of mine said, you need to sell everything because that 67, that is the best sounding guitar that you have. It sounds amazing. So all these different people have chimed in with different opinions. So again, this is about just kind of walking in with your eyes open as far as, vintage guitars. Not trying to bash vintage because I like vintage, but it is kind of sad with how expensive the guitars have gotten. It's, because they've gone out of the range of being, a player guitars, and even what we call player vintage have even gotten really expensive because, when a Blackguard's 50 grand, even one that's had the body and neck refinished and is missing the original pickups, they're still going to ask like $10,000 for it, which to me, it's like, that's a shell. But that's the way the market works, and you need to be aware of that. And frankly, I think the boutique guys are doing a great job. I think, if you're, there are great guitars coming out of the custom shop. There's great, guitars from Danocaster, Carson Hess, Nacho, Joe Riggio. There's a bunch of guys, making, great new guitars. And, and so I hope that if, like when my friend called, what I wish he would have said was, I found this vintage guitar that I fell in love with. That's a cooler statement than I just want to buy a vintage guitar. Because that's one thing, when you play some vintage guitar and you just fall in love with it, the way it sounds and the way it plays, and you can, hopefully afford it. I mean, that's a great thing. But I think it's dangerous, and I think we've all gotten into this mindset, and I have too, where, vintage guitars are cool, and it's cool to own, vintage stuff. So I'll tell you one, kind of last story just to kind of address the fact that vintage guitars are really, they really vary a lot. And, you can't just say, hey, blackguards are amazing and they're all similar or something like that. I ran into Vince Gill at Joe Glazer's shop, and part of me was like, don't bother him. And I have met him before, and I've interacted with him before, but I mean he doesn't know me. And so I was just asking him, because he adds a second string tree to all of his blackguards. And in fact, I have this string tree right here that Joe Glazer has started selling, and these are like $6, and I'm just messing around with it. This is not an endorsement. I haven't decided whether I want to keep this or not, but I'm still just kind of messing around with it. But this is a string tree that covers 3 strings. And so Vince really likes the downward pressure that you get from a second string tree. And so even on his old blackguards, he has that added. So I was asking him more about the guitar that he had in the shop at that point. Was a 51 Nocaster that the body had been stripped, and he had it. And so I was just asking him about, well, what made you buy this guitar? And he said, for years, I have been trying to find a guitar like my 53 Tele. So his main 53 Tele, that kind of white blonde looking guitar with the black pickguard that he's been playing since the early 80s, that's his favorite guitar. And so even with Vince Gill's, kind of fame and the amount of money that he has and the amount of pull that he has in the vintage world, he has not been able to find a guitar like that one. And so he's bought a bunch of blackguards, and none of them have the sound and the same kind of feeling neck as his old one. And so this 51 Nocaster was the closest he had been able to find so far. But I just thought that was very, kind of interesting to think about. Okay, here's this guy that he has the wherewithal to track something down, but even he can't find it. That 53 that he has, he can't find another one. And he just wants another one so that if he breaks a string, or that he could have one in another tuning. But he has not been able to find a guitar that he can just switch easily and then have it where it sounds and feels like his old 53. So anyway, so that's kind of the vintage guitar thing. And I will say about old wood, with acoustic guitars, old wood there's not even you can't even argue that, because old acoustic guitars sound so much better than new ones. And I love new acoustic guitars too. I have a Waterloo guitar that's great, but I mean the old dry acoustic guitars, they just sound amazing. So I had some of you guys say, we show at least one lick, at the end of each episode. And so here I'm going to show 2 of my favorite kind of double string bends. So we're going to do this in the key of B. And so this is one. Okay, and all you're doing is taking this right here, and you're bending it up. And I've just always liked that bend. It's a good double string bend. And I tend to start where it's already bent. Or sometimes I don't. And then another one would be just to do a double string bend here. And that's just where... So you can go... So those are some cool double string bends to work on and have fun with. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and and you'll just think about, before you go blindly out wanting to get a vintage guitar, think about it, and Well, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.